Hello there. My name is Kendra McKinley, and I'm a musician from San Francisco, and you're listening to the Musicality podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi. This is Christopher, founder of Musicality, and welcome to the Musicality podcast. Today I'm joined by Kendra McKinley, a San Francisco singer-songwriter who we interviewed on our website last year after a cover song she recorded made us sit up and pay attention. Her music has been described as having a striking musicality, and I think that's a great way of putting it. So I was delighted to have the opportunity to sit down with her and learn more about where that musicality came from and how she goes about writing and recording her songs. Kendra is a perfect example of a musician that will be called talented and whose music will make you think she has gifts that make it all come easy. But as you'll hear in this interview, those abilities have come through dedication and very thoughtful pursuit of music making. And the opportunities and projects she's enjoyed haven't been dropped in her lap by luck or fate. She's been out there putting in the time and effort and making it happen. In this conversation, we talk about Kendra's musical upbringing and the one pivotal experience that made it suddenly clear that she wanted to be a musical performer as a career. We talk about the process of recording her first album, Treat, and why it turned out to be such a wonderfully varied buffet of songs. And we talk about her recent artist residency in Big Sur, an incredible and unique experience that produced a new EP and helped inform who she's becoming as a musician. Kendra's album, Treat, really lives up to its name, as being a treat for your ears to enjoy, and this conversation was no different. It was fascinating to get to speak with Kendra and understand where this music has come from, and what she has coming up next, so I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I did. My name is Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality podcast from Musical U. Welcome to the show, Kendra. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to speak with you.
So I have so enjoyed listening to your music over the last year or two, and I've dug a little bit into your backstory, but I'd love to hear you tell it. Where did you come from as a musician, and what was learning music like for you?
Sure. So I'm originally from Santa Cruz, California, a little beach town on the Central Coast, and I grew up in an artistic household, so music was a big part of my family's culture, but I didn't start playing until... I really didn't start playing seriously until the final months of high school. Though I did get a guitar when I was 11 years old. I was playing Beatles songs in the privacy of my room, but it was kind of a more private extracurricular activity. So during my senior year of high school, I had an interesting experience where my PE teacher wrote this play called In the Flow that was supposed to be half play, half talent show. It was about a girl named Freedom that realizes that if we recycle, we'll save the world. And if you haven't made the connection between that play and Santa Cruz, California, a quick Google search will fill in all of these kind of crunchy granola, hippy-dippy elements. But about this play, so my teacher wanted me to play the Brother Is rendition of Over the Rainbow on ukulele that I believe was made popular from the 50 First Dates soundtrack, the romantic comedy with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore. So I agreed to do this performance. And when I was driving home from the rehearsal, I made the fatal mistake of leaving my ukulele on the roof of my car. The instrument was totaled, but through the death of this ukulele, I ended up performing on guitar instead in this play, which was the first time in my life that I played guitar and sang publicly. I had, lived a full life as a performer doing theater and choir and dance, but this was the first instance of combining a passion for music with stage performance. And it was an absolute aha moment because it was the combination of my two favorite things. And from that moment on, I just made a shift where I decided I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to write songs. I wanted to be a musical performer. So I started studying classical guitar at university, was writing music all throughout. And yeah, that's kind of where it started.
Amazing. And it sounds like a real epiphany moment for you then.
Yeah.
Was it a very successful performance? Were you able to just kind of nail it and walk away very delighted with yourself? Because I imagine people listening are like, wait, you had to step in at the last minute and play on guitar instead of ukulele? You must have been like terrified.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because since I grew up doing stage performance, I felt really comfortable in that medium. And I don't know, I guess I was comfortable enough in my private practice that I believed that I could play through a song in its entirety without biffing it. But that was another sort of element of this aha moment, was the comfort and the fulfillment of performing music on stage. It's like I actually had a preference for it, because I loved imitation. I loved performing, but I didn't really study theater very seriously. I didn't follow actors. I didn't read plays. I was always pursuing music, but the actual activities I was pursuing were theatrical. So yeah, it was unexpected, both in how enjoyable it was and also, I guess, how easy it was, or just like, the feeling of ease of being in that position was unexpected and reassuring.
Fascinating. I feel like we could dwell on this and unpack it some more, because it is such a challenge for a lot of musicians. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have felt that stage fright and terror at the prospect of performing. But to hear that you describe it as well, you practice privately at home, and you also got experience being comfortable on stage and in front of an audience, it makes perfect sense. You just shove the two together. So that's wonderful. And it sounds like it led on to a new trajectory for you there, going on to university to study music. Is that right?
Entirely different. I mean, it was interesting too, because it wasn't that my life was unmusical before that moment. I was always singing in choir. I was always listening, but pursuing music in a serious way in university was fascinating because I was able to assign vocabulary and music theory to these concepts that I already understood just through listening. So that made it really valuable, because I was able to, suddenly communicate ideas that I had in my head, instead of trying to sing as an example to say specifically what was happening theoretically, or figuring out how to relate that to another player so that a collaboration could occur, or listening back to the music that was so formative in my early years and understanding what it was that I liked about it. So then in my attempts to replicate it through my own music, I had a deeper comprehension of what was happening.
Terrific. That must be the most compelling and exciting description of a college music course I've heard in a long time. Particularly, given that you were mentioning music theory specifically.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I think for a lot of people, the music theory or the ear training becomes a real kind of chore.
Sure.
Because they're missing out on what you just described, which is the benefit it can bring to your musical life if you really get your head and your ears around it. Maybe you could give an example of the kind of thing you were wanting to communicate, or the kind of thing that you listened back to some childhood tracks and were able to pick out after college that you maybe would have been oblivious to as a child, or at least not able to explain.
Sure. Well, I remember the day that we learned about secondary dominance, which, just to kind of touch on it briefly in a way that's not too esoteric or cryptic, it's like the temporary tonicization of a chord in a progression, which I'm almost wondering if that's too much to try and unpack for the listeners, but just, learning that you can create a gravitational pull through particular chord choices that add a different weight or gravity to a chord in a progression. And I remember learning about that and then suddenly realizing that that was a tool used in just about every single Beatles song. And as I mentioned in past interviews, the Beatles were my religious preference. They were what made me excited about music and sort of like the prism through which I understood music. So to have someone say, well, this is what they're doing. This is why these particular chord choices feel so powerful. It's why there's almost like a physical response, or, it's maybe how they manage to add a certain dosage of complexity to an otherwise seemingly simple progression. So just that day, learning that that was a concept, I didn't know that that could be articulated. And so then going back and listening to this music that was already so familiar, there was this whole new depth and richness to it that I never would have known if I didn't go to school.
Very cool. It's something we talk a lot about at Musical U, and I think we've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast, which is a lot of ear training can end up just being putting labels on things you already kind of instinctively know. You know, there is that kind of pure drilling of exercises, but a lot of it is just about putting the mental frameworks in place. And it sounds like it really served that purpose for you to kind of give you a window into understanding what you had already appreciated and enjoyed and taken on board in music.
Sure. I mean, it kind of had the feeling of as if I had grown up, you know, listening to and enjoying poetry, and then someone suddenly taught me how to spell. And so then, like, through learning how to spell, I could then read, I could write it myself. So really, yeah, just having the tool to replicate and understand something that was just mysterious, magical and mysterious.
Wonderful. And so you were having this great kind of brain expanding experience in college. What did your musical life become from there?
Well, beyond learning music theory, I was taking classical guitar instruction because that was one of the requirements of the program that I went through, is that you had to have private classical instrument study and reach a certain level of performance proficiency by the end of the program. And I hated studying classical guitar. I mean, I had no background in it. I had zero intention of becoming a classical performer, and I really just wanted to write songs. So it was kind of like pulling teeth. But blessing in disguise is that I was spending so much time in the music center and, you know, practicing guitar that I started playing piano instead, just because I was procrastinating and wanted to still be musical and no one was telling me how I had to play piano. So beyond just clocking in many hours of practicing and exploring different instruments, I was also being exposed to new music, both through, you know, a Western classical music department and also just meeting other people in college. So I started listening to more jazz music. As I mentioned to you in the past, like I sang in a gypsy jazz ensemble just as like a side job. So I was learning to sing all of, you know, Django Reinhardt's repertoire, sometimes singing in other languages, but also having that sort of harmonic information, informing the way that I thought about harmony, my own musical interests and instincts. And, you know, through that, it was kind of like a gateway drug into other forms of jazz music. Like I realized that I had an affinity for bossa nova music, and that exploration started to inform my songwriting. So all of this to say that my life had just become predominantly musical. Everything that I thought of, everything that I was pursuing, everything that I was interested in was music based. So whether it was an informal gathering of friends sharing music that they were passionate about, or learning about, you know, Franz Liszt or Ravel in class, I was able to access these new musical concepts, these new sonic palettes that, you know, just found their way of showing up in different ways, if that answers the question.
It does, and I think it paints a really vivid and varied picture of what that musical life was becoming. I think one of the things that's most remarkable about your music is the sheer creativity and variety of each song, and your album Treat as a whole. It's constantly kind of keeping the listener interested and engaged in different ways. And, you know, that's very different from, say, a singer-songwriter who sits and strums guitar and every song sounds kind of more or less the same. And so I think I was just really curious to know, what was it that allowed you to develop such a varied palette, as you put it? Whether it was an upbringing thing or a mindset thing, or purely the experiences you went through. Do you have any feeling on that? What's led you to become this particular type of singer-songwriter?
Sure. Well, I think that what's been true of me as a person throughout my entire life, and was true when I did theater as much as when I did music, is that I loved imitation as an art form and was really fascinated by that. So with Treat, it was kind of an example of my quest for self-discovery through music, because I was interested in all of these different musical genres and also had the first experience of recording my own music and realizing it with elaborate production. So instead of having this definitive statement about who I was and the music that I wanted to make, I was just kind of saying, like, here's an example of all of the different music that has influenced me. This is me trying on all these different hats. And this is how I've tried to imitate all of these influential artists or particular songs. So for me personally, when I listen back to Treat, it just feels like a catalog of my own quest to figure out who I was as a musician. And through that process, I felt a stronger pull towards certain songs or felt like they were just like stepping stones into a different direction. But yeah, that's really what it was, is just trying to figure it out. I mean, I guess there's like that Miles Davis quote about how the hardest thing to do in music is to sound like yourself. And I wasn't sure what that was yet, but I liked a lot of different things. So I'm actually currently in the process of making demos for a new record. And that was one of the strategies, was to define a sonic palette and figure out how to make a collection of songs produced through that palette so it does sound like a cohesive album experience rather than it just being a buffet of different genres.
I see. Well, I definitely want to dig into that some more and hear about those demos you've been putting together. But
yes.
First, I'd like to take a step back. I think we kind of skipped a little bit of the story there between college and recording Treat.
Oh, sure.
How did that come to be that you were ready to go into the studio and put together your first full album?
Sure. So after college, I spent some time in Europe traveling and playing music and collecting experiences that would turn into songs that were featured on Treat. So between that trip to Europe and recording Treat, I moved to San Francisco for a 2-month sublet in my older brother AJ's house in the Mission District. And I just wanted to try on being a musician in San Francisco for size. Ended up getting to keep the room that I was subletting. And almost immediately upon my arrival to San Francisco, I discovered and was welcomed into the music scene and started attending these like networking groups and attending lots of shows, playing more radio performances, just kind of fully immersed myself and said yes to any and all opportunities that were presented. And through that networking, I was connected to a man named Andy Freeman, who was a local audio engineer, and he was a big fan of my music, and he and I decided to work together on Treat. So suddenly I had access to an audio engineer who worked at a studio called Coast Recorders, which unfortunately no longer exists. But so I suddenly had this opportunity, and he was asking me, what do you want to record? How are we going to do this? And I didn't have a full album in mind. I didn't have a sonic palette in mind. I just said, okay, well, let's start with these 2 songs. We started with the songs Fine as a Vine and Do What You Want, which are both from Treat. And those songs are definitely reflective of kind of Beatles-esque, like Revolver era, Sunshine, major chord, swirly, saccharine psychedelia that was definitely influential in my life at the time. So we just started from there. I was being asked questions like, what do you want the snare to sound like? Like, what is the drum pattern? What's the bass tone? How do you want the vocals to be processed? Do you want the background vocals to be recorded all at once to one microphone, or will we track them individually? All of these things were questions that I'd never considered and had never been asked of. I only ever thought about the actual composition, the arrangements, and then the performance. So this was all very new to me. I didn't know how to steer this ship. But through the process and being asked these questions, I learned a tremendous load. I suddenly was able to think differently about this music that I was making. And I feel like that sort of personal evolution is also made apparent on Treat because the songs are so varied. And yeah, I mean, after that first day of recording those 2 songs, the next were Honey and Canyon Cannon. One is like a soul revival song, and the other one we refer to as the heavy metal witch seance. So even at that point, all of these songs had such drastically different sonic palettes, such different production choices, and kind of didn't quite seem like they fit all in the same record. So yeah, just Treat as a whole is kind of an example of how I learned to be in a studio, how I learned how to create an album, which is also an interesting place to be because I feel like so few artists are making full records at this point, just because the way that most music is consumed is in like a single format. People want to hear an individual track, or they want to experience music through a music video. So it's kind of a retired art form. And I think that putting together a body of work and thinking about the sequencing and the more macro narrative arc that can be communicated through song selection and sequencing is an art form in and of itself. And I was fortunate to be working with my older brother, AJ, who plays in my band and also function as a producer, because not only did we come from the same musical background and have the sort of advantage of family communication where you don't have to use as much language, but he was able to not only help me in answering these questions, but sort of use his own experience to steer me and help me better articulate ideas that I was having.
Amazing. It certainly wouldn't be apparent to the listener that this was a debut album or a learning experience. You know, the final product sounds extremely polished and very, I was about to say cohesive, I'm not sure that's the right word, but very well put together, because as we've said, you know, there's a lot of variety packed in there. I think that gives a terrific glimpse into how you were developing as a songwriter and a recording artist. And I'd love to talk about a couple of your more recent projects. You mentioned one, which is your upcoming record.
Yes.
And you've recently completed a residency at the Henry Miller Memorial Library in Big Sur. And
yes.
That just sounds fantastic. So I'd like to hear about that in isolation.
Sure.
But I wonder if we could maybe use those two projects as a way to talk a bit more about your songwriting process and how you approach creating something new and developing it and getting to the point of recording it, because I'm sure a lot of people listening are curious to know.
Sure. Well, to speak about songwriting specifically, I would say that 90% of what I write is autobiographical. So I have to have life experiences in order for there to be fodder for the songs. And I'm a very romantic person, so you know, all it takes is traveling to a new place, meeting a new person, experiencing a new intense emotion, and then I usually want to, or just like feel propelled towards translating that into music. I generally say that when I'm writing a song, it's like a musical kernel will pop into my head, usually first as a melodic fragment, and I will record an improvisation around that melody. You know, I'll just like turn on GarageBand or record a voice memo on my iPhone of just improvising around that melody and listen back to it until a sort of character around that musical kernel informs itself. I kind of think of songwriting very much like getting to know a person, where you learn so much more about them if you listen and if you kind of give them space to present themselves. Because anytime that I've sat down and said, like, I want to write a song, I want it to be like this, I'm not actually giving the music room to have its inherent character. So how a song is seen to fruition is relative to the song. Sometimes it's miraculous and I can write and complete a song in an afternoon. Other times, again, it's like getting to know a person, where you kind of have to be patient. You need to allow it to reveal itself when it's comfortable, if that makes sense. Generally what happens is a song will start with the melody, and I will start to hear the background vocal arrangement. A lot of my musical instincts come from this like 1960s chamber pop influence. So the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Joni Mitchell, it's all very vocally rich, or at least that's like what I've always responded to most in music. So before I have lyrics or even a completed song form, I hear how I want the voices to exist around that. And that's always kind of been the nucleus, or the most important part of my songwriting process.
That can be quite a hard thing to capture. I'm imagining, if you have a melodic fragment, you kind of just turn on your mic and you record it. If you're imagining those kind of lush Beach Boys harmonies, do you have a way to quickly kind of capture that and lay it down in a way that it can kind of breathe and you can return to it in future?
Sure. Well, I mean, usually what happens is as soon as I hear a melody in my head, I can hear it, how it would be realized with a 3-part harmony, or I've just always thought contrapuntally. And I think about melodic shapes and how a backing vocal part would exist within that. That just kind of all happens in my head. I would say that, the majority of the composition process just happens in my mind. And then I use GarageBand to hear it back and then make the minute edits. But one of my favorite ways of writing music is with my looping station. I use a Line 6 DL4 delay pedal, and that allows me to record and realize these harmonic ideas, these vocal parts in real time, so I can just hear how it all sounds. So a combination of that and then just making really rough demos with GarageBand, with headphones and singing through the built-in microphone has generally been the process. And I'm starting to dip my toes into more elaborate recording processes, but that's a universe in and of itself.
Very cool. And we had an episode of the podcast recently all about audiation and imagining music in your mind and the various benefits of that. It sounds like you have a particularly vivid musical imagination, the ability to conjure up those 3-part harmonies as you kind of create the music. Is that something you've always found easy or something you've worked on over the years?
Well, it wasn't until I actually went to music school that I realized that was maybe something that not everyone experiences. Like I can recall being a young child and listening to the Beatles and being able to isolate all of the different harmony parts, or how I would think of additional harmonies. And when I sang along would kind of, add my own personal dimension to it. And I thought that everyone had that same sort of intimacy or interest with harmony. So that was an interesting realization to understand that maybe it was a little unusual, but yeah, I mean, it can sometimes be distracting. Like if I go and see live music, it either like I get inspired by what I'm hearing and kind of start writing during the concert, which always feels kind of rude, but I can't turn it off. Or just when I hear someone performing, I can also hear the harmonies with it. So that's just, I guess, how my brain works.
Fantastic. That's fascinating to hear. So you were talking a bit there about looper pedals and GarageBand and quite a kind of tech-supported way of capturing song ideas. Mm-hmm. On the other end of the spectrum, you were recently doing this residency at the library, which was kind of a, as I understand it, solo off in the wilderness, just you and a pen experience. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Oh God, it was dreamy to say the least. So Big Sur, California is like everything that is magical about the California coastline concentrated into one like 20 to 40 kilometer landscape, depending on if you're like in the concentrated Big Sur town part or just driving across the dramatic coastline. But there's this place called the Henry Miller Memorial Library, which is a bookstore / music venue / creative destination point that was created in memoriam of the author Henry Miller, who wrote Tropic of Cancer, among other titles, and who lived there for many years of his life and actually passed there. But so I had played a handful of shows there over the years and had an intimate relationship with the people that worked there, and had always just said, like, my dream would be to be able to hang out here and focus on songwriting, to be able to really take that work seriously. And it just so happened that over the course of 2 years, Big Sur endured an onslaught of natural disasters. There were fires, there were floods. The flooding caused a crack in one of the main bridges, the Pfeiffer Bridge, and so the bridge had to be torn down. And and shortly after, there was a mudslide just south of the Big Sur town portion of the coastline. So this stretch of coastline was basically left inaccessible. there were 200 locals that were living down there. And if they had to access the outside world for grocery shopping or to do laundry, they would have to drive to the south end of the bridge closure, hike a bypass trail, get into a separate car on the north side of the bridge closure, and then drive into town. So it was very challenging living, but it was also kind of magical in that for an 8-month period of time, Big Sur, which was this major tourist destination, essentially returned to its desolate, dreamy character that it was in the 1970s, where it was this sort of undiscovered gem and attracted a lot of quirky alternative thinkers like Jack Kerouac. Spent a lot of time there. I think he was actually trying to overcome an alcohol addiction by living in a cabin in Big Sur, but just he's, one example. So all this to be said, I was offered by the people at the library to come and do an artist residency during the final weeks of this bridge closure, which meant that I would live in a tent on the Henry Miller Memorial Library property. I would work in the bookshop 3 days a week, selling books to the very few travelers that managed to make it across the bypass trail. And then every moment in between, I was able to use the space for writing. And that is precisely what I did. So for 5 weeks, I got to finally let songwriting be my main job. And it was wild because not only had I always dreamed of being able to have such a focused, devoted relationship to this craft, but I had no Wi-Fi. I had no cell phone reception. My lifestyle was rugged, to say the least. I mean, living in a tent, washing my clothes by hand, preparing all of my meals in an outdoor kitchen with a 2-burner gas stove. And just the majesty of Big Sur combined with the quietude allowed for a type of introspection that I've never quite been able to achieve living in a city and enduring the hustle of, trying to be an artist in the United States. So I was able to achieve an intimacy with my music that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I wrote a lot of music over that time. I developed arrangements for other songs that had already existed. And a dear friend of mine, an engineer named Scott McDowell, who is a friend from San Francisco, drove down across the newly opened bridge. And over the course of 2.5 days, we recorded a collection of songs, 2 of which I wrote at the Henry Miller Library. One of them was the second song that I ever wrote as an angsty high school kid. And another one kind of fit thematically with the other songs. But I performed all the instruments on the EP. It was acoustic guitar, electric bass, upright piano, so many vocal tracks, and a shaker and other minimalistic percussion. But yeah, it was just an interesting experience to have this acoustic, introspective sort of thesis statement as a culmination of this time in the woods. And also, just by contrast, the production value is so much gentler and simpler than Treat. Like, that was a very extroverted, theatrical, bold production. So it almost felt like a palate cleanser to have something that was quieter. It's a lot of words I just shared.
No, that sounds inspirational, and I mean that in the sense of inspiring you, but I'm sure that story alone will be inspiring our listeners. The idea of really just giving yourself the space and the disconnect and the change of environment to inspire a new kind of creativity in music. It sounds like a wonderful experience. I'm sure our listeners are as envious as I am right now. That sounds wonderful.
I wish for all creative people that they will have an experience to just give in completely to their craft. I mean, I feel tremendously privileged to have had that experience, and also just recognizing what it does for your creative output to be able to have that focus and isolation is something that so few creatives get to experience. And I sincerely hope that others will be able to pursue and find those opportunities, because you learn so much more about yourself when you're not just trying to be creative in like the wee small hours of the night in between other daily responsibilities.
So it's terrific that you had the opportunity to capture some of that in an EP at the end of the experience. And it sounds like it let you kind of move on your craft or approach it in a different way. You said earlier something really interesting, which is in approaching your new record, you've been trying to kind of focus in on a particular sonic palette and put together something that's a bit more on the same page. Can you tell us what that means to you and how you've been going about that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I started to think about making a record like hosting a party. And if you want to be a gracious host, it really helps if you prepare the space, if you think about the type of experience that you're offering your guests. I mean, like if you're going to throw a dinner party, you want to clean your house, you want it to be warm and open, you want to consider the lighting. How are you going to feed them? Like, where will you host them? Will there be activities? Like, what is the tone that you're trying to set? Because to perform music, I think, is like a generous endeavor. It's like you want to provide an experience, you want to provide a space. So by defining a sonic palette, I feel like I'm just maybe being a little bit more considerate about what I want to provide for the audience. And bringing it back to what I was saying about making Treat is that I had no idea what I was doing. I had musical instincts, but I was green in this medium and being asked to make decisions that I wasn't sure of. And it wasn't until the culmination of that project that I was able to have like a more macro understanding of what that larger process was. So with this new record, and also, as an extension of this experience in Big Sur and getting to reflect and think more about what I want to say as an artist, I wanted to have that deeper understanding of what it was that I was trying to say and how I wanted to say it before getting into the studio. So the way that I did that was, again, I was working with my older brother as the producer because he's my best friend and musical confidant. Is we had a conversation of what is this record? What are the influences? We put together a sonic mood board of sorts. Influences included D'Angelo's Black Messiah record, Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark, Funkadelic's Maggot Brain. So there was a lot more R&B and soul influence, but we were thinking about it like the Joni Mitchell influence is like jazz infused, feminine, has that element of introspection, but the imagery is very colorful. It is narrative. Lyrics or storytelling, but then like the Funkadelic and D'Angelo influence is like it also invokes that stank face. Like it's something that you might feel a more physical response in your hips rather than jumping up and down music. We talked about color, like the color lavender came up a lot for whatever, if people maybe have like a more synesthetic response to music, or there's myriad ways of interpreting that, but lavender for me kind of embodied a sort of coolness that I wanted to achieve. And so with all of that in mind, we then took all of the songs that I had written but were unrecorded, and we played and I laid down extremely simple demos of them. Simple to the extent where I was just recording one vocal and one guitar. I would strum the chords on the downbeat and sing the melody, leaving all of this space. And then through which we started to add all these different elements and thinking about rhythmic information and as an extension of the sonic palette, what would the instrumentation be? And we found out what those things were and how they would be related between the songs. So things came up like the clavinet, wah guitar, certain synthesizers, 808 drums. And by applying this sonic information, all these different songs, we were able to suddenly hear which songs fit together and which songs were the outliers. And so that was something that I never did with Treat. It was just like, we're going to record these songs. A couple months later, let's try these. So to have this opportunity to think more critically about how the pieces fit together before entering into the studio in a serious way has offered clarity. Or, now it's like I have a 7-song demo of all these songs that fit together. So now as I complete the album and write songs, I can have a more informed sense of how to fill in those blanks. It's like these songs that exist already occupy a certain function in the record, but it's missing this sort of thing. So writing a song to fill that void.
Awesome. You come across as someone who finds it all very easy and natural. You know, you clearly, you're very self-aware and very thoughtful about how you go about this whole process. Almost the opposite of the scatterbrained creative who just kind of fumbles their way through a music career.
I think I just covered up well.
Maybe so. Well, given that, I would love to get your insight for anyone who's maybe at the start of that journey of creating their own music, or maybe they're partway through it and it feels like it's just not quite coalescing in the way they'd hoped. I'd love to hear any advice or insights you have from your own journey so far that might help them kind of more quickly get to a satisfying existence as a musician.
Sure, absolutely. Well, two things come to mind in response to that question. For one, I think that there's a very distorted sense of what it means to be a musician or to be musical in the West. I mean, I suppose I can only speak about my experience of living in California, but I believe that this is probably true for a lot of other places in the US, is that there's this notion that if you don't show an immediate musical talent, then it's not something that you can develop or something that you can enjoy. So countless people have like a traumatic experience where they're in elementary school band and they pick up a clarinet and it doesn't sound very good, or they try singing and their classmates laugh at them. So then they decide, I'm not musical, I can't enjoy this. So then you find that the only people that are pursuing it are like self-proclaimed musicians or people that are pursuing it professionally. I think that that is a travesty, and I'm baffled that music, unlike other subjects, is something that people don't understand, that it does take work and it is a process and it takes practice and self-discovery. I mean, I think about being in high school and I took chemistry, which is something that I believed myself that I couldn't do. But when I did poorly on an exam, I would, stay after school and do tutoring, and I would work towards it because it was something that in order to participate, in order to pass the grade, I had to work extra hard on it. Music is the same way. And I also think that it really depends on how people are instructed too. When small children are forced to play this very rigid, regimented classical music from a young age, they're not being ushered into like this vast universe of self-expression and color that is achievable or available like through all these other musical genres. So I think that people should feel encouraged to stick with it and to work hard, but to also maybe explore different approaches to being musical. And like maybe I'll put a pin in that because I am also a music teacher, and I can talk about my personal approach to teaching music as a way to counter that very rigid classical instruction. But secondly, like when it comes to songwriting specifically, I think that the hardest thing to do is to finish a song. And that is true of absolute beginners and professionals, because I think that it's really easy to dwell on a result, to think to yourself, like, I want to write something good. I want it to be this way. And if you're so focused on that final result, you are not achieving the necessary intimacy with the process. And it's through that process that you have these self-discoveries, that you learn more about what it is that you want to create. So I always tell my students and my peers that they need to write and finish more songs. They need to be willing to write something that sucks, because it is a more fulfilling and more educational process than having, many files of incomplete songs. I say this, and it's something that I still struggle with and have to remind myself. But, sometimes as an exercise, I will say, you know what, I'm going to write something that I feel totally embarrassed by. I'm going to write that sappy love song with the most cliche lyrics. I'm going to write a predictable chord progression, but I'm going to finish it. Set a timer and do the thing. Because then when you listen back to it, you have a more concrete sense of what it is that you want to change about it. And it's easier to develop it if you're listening to the final product. Otherwise, it just remains incomplete because you're stunted by your own visions of grandeur. So I think that finishing more songs and just accepting that music is a really hard, abstract thing that is kind of indefinable or could be defined by many things. That's one of my favorite aspects about it, is that even as someone that is a self-proclaimed professional music that makes it every day, there is still so much that I have to learn and so much to gain and so much that I'm humbled by and curious about. And that's never going to stop. But you kind of have to get out of your own way and just enjoy the process.
Wonderful. I think those are two really phenomenal points for people to keep in mind. And, I 100% agree with your attitude towards that question of talent or, inclusivity in music. Yeah. I would love to hear your teaching work. How do you go about this with maybe younger students or beginner stage students that helps them?
Sure. So I've been working with people of all ages. I've led song circles for infants and parents. My youngest private student is 6 years old. But and then I'll teach everyone from high school kids to adults, and everything from singing to instrument playing. But I find that I have more songwriting students now at this point, and I encourage all of the same things, where they just have to finish songs. They have to be willing to write something dorky. They have to be willing to write something that they might not ever show anyone. But I also feel like people actually end up writing with so much more conviction and so much more authenticity if they write under a deadline and they're forced to say that thing that maybe they're embarrassed of. And I think that it is so transformative to be in that position where you're writing in an autobiographic sense and you're being vulnerable, because not only do you learn more about your musical process, but you learn a lot more about yourself. So I, with my students, I just try and offer them a safe space to play that song that maybe they feel self-conscious of. But it is also such an abstraction. It's not like there is a correct way to write a song. If anything, it is through this experience of self-discovery that you find what process works for you. So I want to try and nurture that. I also tell people that they should be learning songs that they like. I didn't grow up studying classical music, but I do remember having friends that would say, like, yeah, I have a weekly piano lesson and my parents say that I can stop when I'm 18. Like it was just something that they were enduring. But then suddenly to have that sort of relationship to music robs them of like the vast and wonderful world that it is. And I do believe that there is a genre or style or an artist for everyone. So like with a lot of my students, I tell them I would so much rather teach you how to play a song that you love instead of dwelling on technical exercises, because it's also a lot easier to practice if it's a song that you like. So that and just telling them learn as many songs as you can. Find an artist that you really love. I'll help you figure out the chord progression. I'll coach you through this vocal styling, but just remembering that music is really enjoyable and celebrating that aspect of the making and accepting that even if it's challenging, that if you are disciplined, that you can transcend those challenges and continue to make these valuable self-discoveries throughout the process.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like you're imparting your own broad and richly varied musical tastes and musical creativity and that joy of music making to your students, and that's a wonderful thing. Kendra, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a delight to chat with you.
The Musicality podcast is brought to you by Musical U. Learn more at musical-u.com.
As I talked with Kendra, I wondered whether we should include some of her music right here in the podcast, because I know that having heard her describe it and talk about the process of writing and recording her songs, you're going to be desperately curious to actually hear it. But as Kendra touched on, the way people consume music has changed so much, perhaps not for the better, and I'm not sure that the podcast listening context is really likely to do justice to her music. So I decided it would be better to encourage you to visit her website and follow the links we'll have in the show notes so that you can listen to her music with your full attention. Sorry to tease, but you'll just have to go and listen properly. There are two things that really stand out to me about Kendra, apart from the wonderful creativity and variety in her songwriting and recording. The first is that she is a musician who really embodies musicality, and in a conscious, thoughtful, deliberate way. She took her childhood love of music and applied the music theory and ear training provided at college to become a singer-songwriter who seems to be capable of anything. I loved her comparison of music and chemistry, because clearly she was not passionate about chemistry and was hugely passionate about music, yet she approached them both with the same openness to learning and the belief that she would be able to improve. The second thing is that she is working hard to make things happen. You might not guess it from the free and easy way she talks about it all, but if you stop for a minute, you'll realize that almost everything she described in her story is a testament to her drive and passion and willingness to be open to opportunities. Whether it was stepping up last minute to play guitar on stage in high school, or collaborating with various musicians and groups in college, or immersing in the San Francisco music scene and finding a recording opportunity, or landing an amazing artist residency in Big Sur. These things didn't happen by chance. They happened because Kendra was getting out and trying things and being open to every opportunity. That's something which she mentioned is also a key part of her songwriting process, to make sure she always has the life experiences to inspire new songs. I loved hearing about her artist residency, and although I'm not a songwriter myself, I think you can't help but feel tempted by that notion of a creative getaway where you can focus fully on your music making or creating something new, totally away from your normal life and responsibilities and the endless inputs of the day-to-day. Kendra kindly gave us a preview version of one of the tracks from the EP that was recorded at the end of that residency, and it is sounding fantastic. Definitely worth checking out as soon as it's released. If you're a songwriter yourself, or you'd like to be, then do take on board her big piece of advice. She said that the hardest thing to do is to finish a song, but it's maybe the most important thing to do too. Otherwise you get too hung up on the perfect final result, and you don't get the opportunity to learn and improve. She'll take this even to the point of challenging herself to speed write a song, or to write something totally formulaic, just for the sake of practicing finishing. It's wonderful that Kendra is now sharing her insights and attitude with her students through teaching instruments and songwriting, and she does provide lessons online. So if you are excited to hear about her approach and interested to study with her yourself, then do get in touch through the contact page on her website, kendramckinley.com. Kendra is about to do some touring over in Europe, as well as releasing her EP and finishing up her new record. So to get the latest news and music, be sure to look up and follow Kendra McKinley on Facebook and Instagram. As always, we'll have links to all of those in the show notes to this episode. Thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for our next one, where we'll be talking about one thing that can add spice and variety to songwriting, and that is polyrhythms.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners.